Okay, so I just want to welcome everyone to our little web event. Just today we're going to have Thomas giving us an introduction to the identify function, which is very timely since the City Nature Challenge has just finished. And this is a really good, easy way to contribute to identifying a lot of the different species that we've all observed during the last week. Thomas is a very experienced iNaturalist from Sydney, and he's kindly agreed to help us out and give us a little bit of a tutorial on how to use this really interesting function on iNaturalist. And it's a far easier way to find things that need to be identified and help out the community in doing this. So I'm just going to pass over to Thomas and let him run the show while I just sit back and I'll probably monitor the chat, but Thomas will do that as well. Okay, so off you go, Thomas.
No worries. And as always, feel free to, as Stephen said, ask questions at any time whatsoever. So pretty much whenever I find that new users to iNaturalist go to identify observations, they tend to use this Explore tab. This is kind of the most intuitive way to see observations in a really nice, easy format, very large thumbnails, 96 observations to a page. So very, very easy way to visualize observations. And a handy thing that this Explore tab has is not only observations at an individual level, but then you can also swap to species view, as well as, of course, looking at who the top identifiers are for certain groups, and similarly who the top observers are. And I'm in the exact same basket for the first probably year and a half of using iNaturalist myself. This is how I identified things. And whilst this tab on iNaturalist is great for just purely viewing observations and scrolling through them, it's really a massive hassle to identify things because you essentially have to identify observations one at a time. So for example, if I wanted to ID these top 4 observations here, I've got 2 options. Either I click on each one individually, wait for it to load, make an ID, then click the back arrow, and then do that whole process again for the next one. And you can see just for a single observation, that took probably 15, 20 seconds of load time. So that's really tedious. A slightly quicker way would be to right click on each one and click open link in new tab. But still, nonetheless, you can see it takes time for each observation to load. It takes time for me to swap between each tab and add each ID. And overall, if you're doing this on a very small scale, it's probably okay. But if I'm looking to ID, 50, 100, 500 observations, this is extremely tedious and time wasting. So what you can use instead is this really cool Identify tab. So the Identify tab, as you would imagine from the name, is specifically designed to be as efficient as possible when you are specifically identifying observations. So what I'm going to do is basically just run through how to use this Identify tab and just a few little tricks and tips basically, and essentially how it differs from that Explore tab. So really, everything that exists on that Explore tab also exists in some format on the Identify tab, except for one thing and one thing only. And I'll show you what that is. So what you'll notice is that normally, if I open an observation and I click in the identification bar, you'll see that you get the classic suggestions of species that the iNaturalist's AI thinks the observation could be, as you'd all be familiar with. However, when you're on the identify modality, you'll notice that if I click add ID and I click in the bar, there are no computer vision options. So that is the only way that the Explore tab differs, essentially, in terms of functionality compared to the Identify tab, is that if you click in the ID bar, the suggest and identification bar, you'll get all the computer vision suggestions when you're using Explore. But on identify, you will not get those suggestions. So that's just one thing I want to get out there straight away, that identify has everything that explore has, and indeed has more functionality than explore. However, explore does have this one tiny little benefit that to some people is useful, right? Because I will go on just a 2-minute tangent and say that traditionally the computer vision options have not been that crash hot for Australia, particularly for invertebrates and plants to some extent. And this is a situation that most iNaturalist users will be familiar with, whether you've used the site for a while or whether you're more of a new user, is that when you click here and you see what the computer vision suggests, many of the options will often be American species, specifically those from California, or indeed European species. And that's purely because this computer vision is trained on a number of observations basis. So the more observations of a species are uploaded to iNaturalist, the better and better the computer vision gets at recognizing that species. So of course, because there are so many American users, and because iNaturalist originated in California and the US, the vast majority of observations are of American species. So of course, when we upload Australian observations, many of the suggestions are often for American species that look really similar. However, having said that, and the reason I wanted to bring this up is that as of course, Australian observations have increased over time and more Australian users have started using iNaturalist, the computer vision suggestions have gotten better and better for Australian observations. And we've now reached a situation where you can pretty much upload any bird photograph and you're almost guaranteed to get the computer vision suggesting correct species. The same goes for fish. Fish are very, very good right now. Plants are getting better and better. And indeed, the invertebrate taxa, which have always performed the worst, are getting better and better as well. And you actually find now, if you upload a lot of the common Australian moths or common Australian seashells, that the computer vision will actually correctly suggest the species. So with that little bit out of the way, that's the only thing, as I said, the Explore tab has over Identify tab. We'll dive into the thick of things. So straight away, one thing you'll notice is that there are fewer observations per page on the Identify tab. And personally, I actually think that's a good thing, because for the observations, for the Explore tab, I find it a little bit onerous to have to scroll down through 96 different observations on a single page. Whereas you'll notice that for the Identify tab, there are only 30 observations per page. Now, there's actually two different views you can use. The default view, I believe this is the default view, or it's at least the one I have it on, has 4 rows of 7 and then a row of 2. However, you can actually press this little button here to make them all larger. So if you'd like to see some of the images at a larger size, and indeed you can make them larger later on as well, but for now, whilst you're just looking at all 30 at once, you can choose to make them larger, and then they go into 6 rows of 5. So either of these is completely fine. That's purely personal preference. The other thing you'll notice is that the main aspect here is that there are 2 bars, and these are just the classic search bars that you'll find on the Explore tab as well. This is where you start searching for the different taxa that you want to ID. So for example, let's say I want to ID birds. I now see that all the observations are birds. Similarly for place, I can type in New South Wales. I've got to type in the words here. And you'll see that I'm now only looking at birds in New South Wales. The other really important thing to recognize is that when you click on the Identify tab first up, there are 2 default settings that are automatically applied, but you can change these. The very first default setting is when you click filters, and you'll see that only needs ID is ticked. So whenever you click on Identify, only observations that are needs ID are shown to you by default. So you will not see anything that is already reached research grade, and you will not see any casual observations. If you want to see those, you have to tick the boxes. So I've ticked those, and now I'm looking at all observations. So research grade and needs ID and casual. Okay, and if I only want to look at research grade, for example, that's completely fine. Now I'm only looking at research grade. And just as a very small time saver, you'll notice that I don't even need to click update search. All I have to do is tick the box. So if I tick needs ID here and untick research grade, you'll see, and then this will take just a little bit to load because I'm looking at everything. So immediately you'll see that it all loads. So whenever I update any of the filters in this box, you don't actually need to click update search. So I'm not 100% sure why that button actually exists because it's completely redundant. But whenever, just keep in mind, so whenever you're updating any of these filters, you don't need to click update search. So that's the first one, that's the default. So by default, you only see needs ID. And if you want to see other things, you have to change it. The other thing that is set by default is that once you have reviewed an observation, it no longer appears in here. And what I mean by review is you've either added a comment, should I say you've either added an identification to an observation, or you've ticked one of the data quality boxes. So for example, you see someone has uploaded a photo of a pot plant. If you tick the down arrow for organism is wild, that means that you have reviewed the observation, essentially. If I go to this and I add an identification, I have reviewed the observation. And the final way to review something is to go to the observation and then tick the little box that says mark as reviewed. So those are the three ways for you to review an observation. And once an observation has been reviewed, by default, it will no longer appear in this identify tab. If you do want it to appear, you're going to tick this box, and now I'm only seeing reviewed, right? So these are all the observations that I have reviewed. So if I click on one, for example, you'll see that I have added an observation, an identification, I should say, to this observation. It now counts as reviewed. So you can see at the bottom as well, you can see the number. So all up I've reviewed 655 pages of these 30 observations. So if I untick that, it will go back to, after a little while of loading, it will go back to only showing ones that I have not reviewed. Now, just to clarify whether you can do both simultaneously, let me just test one thing. I'm not actually 100% sure. Hopefully this works. Okay, no, it doesn't. Okay, so as far as I can tell, it is not possible to simultaneously view observations that you both have reviewed and have not reviewed. So you have to choose one or the other. There may be a way to tinker with the URL, but if I figure that out, I will post that somehow for you guys to see. But as far as I can see at face value, you either have to view all observations that you have reviewed or all observations that you have not reviewed. You cannot do both at the same time from what I can make out. Are there any questions thus far? So fairly simple stuff so far. Okay, so the other thing that you'll notice about the identify screen, and this is probably the best feature of the identify screen and why it's so much more time efficient than identifying through the explore tab, is that observations that are at a species level will have this little agree button. So instead of actually having to type in an ID or even having to open the observation, so I don't even need to open the observation. If I agree, and let's go to something that I will actually agree with. So we'll go to Australian birds. Now I've got to open that. So you'll notice straight away, because this one was not at a species level, I had to manually open the observation and then click agree here. However, if we look at this one, for example, the current ID is already sitting at a species level. So all I have to do is click that agree button, and straight away I've agreed with that observation, and I didn't even have to open it. And you'll now see, pardon me, sorry, you'll now see that a little gray box goes over the observation, and there's a little blue tick that says reviewed. Go to the next one, just hit agree. So of course you can't always do this. So for example, with this one, you can't even see the bird with a little thumbnail. So I've got to actually open it, take a closer look, zoom in a bit, say, yep, that looks like a Pacific black duck. Now I can hit agree there. But essentially, here's Stephen's very nice photo of a heron. Yeah, yep. So I hit agree.
Sorry about that, Mr. Thomas. That was across, and I thought I could get it, and I took about 4 photographs, and that was the best one.
No, I'm very familiar with that feeling.
Cheeky, and normally I'd delete it, so I do apologise for that.
But yeah, so this is one of the real massive sticking points of the Identifiers tab, is that you do not even have to open any observation at all, as long as you can confidently ID it from this small thumbnail. And indeed, as I said before, if you use this tool, you can view them at a slightly larger size and makes it a little bit easier. All you have to do is click the agree button and it will review it for you. Now, just one thing to notice is that it's sometimes, particularly during events like the City Nature Challenge, when you've got so many people that are using the site at once, it can take a little while for the reviewed screen to go over. And sometimes if you just open it up and click off again, it'll appear for you. Then when you want to go to the next page, all you have to do is go down and click 2, and we then go to the next page of birds from Australia. Now, this is a really, really important thing, and this is perhaps the most important little trick to keep in mind for the Identify tab that not a lot of people are aware of. Let's say that, so at the moment, I have 30 observations on the screen here. And let's say I click agree on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I make IDs on these bottom 6. They all fade out to gray and they've become reviewed. I then say, okay, the other 24 on this page, I don't know what they are. I only want to identify those 6 at the bottom. I'm now going to click on the next page and go to page 3. Now, presumably, I'm now looking at the next batch of 30, right? I had just had a batch of 30. I identified 6. I ignored 24. So I click on the next page and I think, okay, now I'm going to see the next batch of 30. That is not correct. Because what happens on that second page when I reviewed those bottom 6, remember that I said whenever an observation becomes reviewed by you, it disappears from the Identify screen. So what that means is that the first 6 observations on this next page get bumped up onto that previous page. Does that make sense to everyone? And now it means that I'll miss them. So if I had identified those 6 observations at the end of page 2, it means that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 will have gotten bumped up to page 2, and I won't actually be able to see those unless I click on page 2 and go all the way back. So this is actually a way that it's really easy to accidentally miss observations. So the way to get around that is through this. So this is the way to get around this. So let's ID one. I'll just need to play this so I can listen to the call. Okay, I can't hear anything in that observation. let's click on one that I can ID. Yeah, greater crested tern. So I click agree. So that one now blanks out. What I now do is I click refresh on the page. You'll see that that one has now disappeared. And this little raven observation, which was actually on page 3, has now bumped up to page 2. And I haven't missed anything. And now I can say, okay, I don't want to ID that little raven observation. I can now safely go to page 3 and I have not missed anything. So does everyone understand that concept? Because that's probably, as I said, the most important thing in the Identify tab. And it's something that I did not realize occurs for a very long time. So there was quite a while there where I'd be like, I regularly search for all Australian mollusks, for example, to ID. So I'll go through and every 2 or 3 days, I'll say, okay, here's all the seashells that have been observed in Australia for the past few days. I'm going to ID all these. And then a few days later, I might come back and I'll say, oh, someone posted these seashells 5 days ago. And I didn't see them, even though I went through all the mollusk observations. I somehow missed these 10 or I missed these 5. And I was always unsure how they somehow managed to slip through the cracks. And it's because of this way that reviewed observations disappear. Now, one small thing to keep in mind is that sometimes you're lucky and this won't happen to you. And the way that that happens is if in the process of you identifying things and then clicking to the next page, often people will upload more things at the same time. So that will do the opposite. And instead of bumping things up a page, it'll bump things down a page, if that also makes sense. So if I, for example, ID this, and I ID this observation, and if theoretically I just click to the next page without refreshing, I would then miss the first one from the next page, as I explained. However, if simultaneously to me doing that, another user uploaded another photo of a bird, then that one would get bumped back down and would actually balance out and I wouldn't miss anything. And similarly, if simultaneously someone uploaded 2 more birds, say, then this last one will actually get bumped down to the next page as well. And when I go to the next page, I'll be seeing it for the second time. But the important thing is that I won't be missing anything. So just to summarize that, whenever you are on each page and you have reviewed any observation, whether by adding an ID or marking the data control, the data quality assessment, just make sure you keep refreshing the page until there are no more observations on the page that you want to ID, then you can move to the next page. And that is the only 100% surefire way that you will not miss a single observation. So just to clarify one of those little things I mentioned before, I said that there are 3 different ways to review an observation. So one is to actually identify something. So keeping in mind, this is a really important thing. If I just add a comment to this observation, it will not be counted as reviewed. So if I go back and look at birds in a couple of days' time, this observation will still appear for me. So if you just want to add a comment to something without adding an ID, it will still appear as unreviewed for you. So that's just something to keep in mind. So the other way to review things is to tick this little reviewed box. And the reason that, I almost never use that box, but a lot of people do use it. And the reason you may want to use that is if you consider that observation to probably be unidentifiable for now, and you don't want it to keep appearing. So to give a really good example of that, and here's one that I'll mark for myself now, I periodically look up man o' wars to ID. And most of the time they're IDable. So for example, this one, and I can add my ID. But for example, this one has been sitting there for a while. Now, to me, this is not a Portuguese man o' war, but at the same time, I can't really suggest what it actually is. It could be a number of things that are not in common taxa. So really, if I wanted to bump this away from Portuguese man o' war, I'd probably have to bring it back to life. But it does get quite a bit irritating because every time I search up man o' wars, this observation still keeps appearing for me. So what I can actually do is tick this little reviewed box. This observation is now reviewed. So now when I search for Menowars, it will not appear for me. So it's no longer clogging up my identify screen. It won't keep appearing every single time I identify this group, even though I don't want to ID that specific observation. It's now out of sight, out of mind. So that's just one handy little tool where if you have a situation where it's a really garbage photo, for example, and the subject is completely blurry and you know that you don't want to waste your time identifying it, or indeed it's just simply not identifiable, you can just click that little reviewed box and it means that it will disappear from the identify screen for you forever, unless you are specifically reviewing reviewed observations. Now, if we compare to the Explore tab again, you'll see that all the typical filters are there. So when you're on the Explore tab, you can obviously filter by captive observations. You can filter just for threaded things, whether things have photos, whether things have sounds, so on and so forth. All of these things also exist on the Identify tab, just as they do for Explore. So you can also look for the major categories. So you can obviously type in birds, but you can also just click on this little box and it will take me to all the birds. Now, one that a lot of people like to use is instead of specifically searching for a certain taxonomic group, you can actually search for unknown. And what this does is it takes me to all the observations that currently do not have an ID. Yeah, and you got to unclick them. Sorry, so that's another thing that I should mention. This is a way to actually look for multiple groups at the same time. So if I wanted to look at all herps, so normally if I wanted to look to search for reptiles, I would have to do it separately to searching for amphibians because they're not a monophyletic group. Whereas if I click both of these, I can now look at both these groups at the same time. So I'm now looking at amphibians and reptiles simultaneously. So it just means if I want to go back to say only reptiles, I just have to unclick that amphibian box. But as I was saying, a really interesting filter that a lot of people use is this little leaf, outline leaf with a question mark in it, and that's unknown. And what that does is it takes me to all observations that currently do not have any identification attached to them whatsoever. So what a lot of identifiers will do, so obviously many people have an area of expertise. So some people are experts at seashells or experts at birds or experts at orchids. So what they'll do when they want to identify things is specifically search for birds or seashells or orchids. Whereas other people may not be an expert in any group, but they still want to help contribute to identifying things. One really cool way of doing that is to identify all the unknowns. So this is a really, really useful thing because if I am looking for seashells, right, to identify, I can only see observations that have already been identified as mollusks. So if someone uploads a photo of a seashell, but they don't attach any ID to it, then it's basically unsearchable, right? Because it doesn't have any identification attached. Similarly, if a person goes out, takes a photo of all these common birds that are really easy to identify, but they don't add an identification themselves when they're first uploading their observation, then again, those observations become almost unsearchable because they don't have any ID attached to them. So the only way, essentially, to search for those observations is to do it with this unknown filter. And I'll just quickly take this question, which was posted in the chat. So Tanya said, is there a way to discard unidentifiable or bad photos? For example, something super blurry or a photo of a blanket. So by discard, do you mean just the marking as reviewed? Or do you mean essentially like deleting that observation entirely or kind of removing it from iNaturalist? or just removing it from you having to view it? Which one did you mean there?
Yeah, if you ever have photos that just are not of a specimen, really, like I'm just looking at that image of a building, maybe when you zoom in it's better, but if someone, you know, accidentally gives their phone to a kid who uploads 10 photos of the floor or something,
Yep.
does that happen much?
Not super commonly. But of course, given iNaturalist has over 1.6 million users now, those kind of things are bound to happen, just purely because they have such a large database. There are a few different ways to deal with it. So if you purely just want to remove it off your screen and you don't want to see it anymore, then all you have to do is click that reviewed button, as I mentioned. But let's say we take this for example. So this is literally a completely white photo. So this is completely blank. Given the fact this person has 470 observations, this seems like it's probably a mistake. Although having said that, that one seems to be a little bit laggy. Okay, so this person has just realized. So this is another little handy thing for you. For anyone who's never seen this screen, if you click on an observation and then this screen pops up, it means that content has now been deleted. So this person just, as we were speaking, coincidentally, realized that they accidentally uploaded that photo of nothing and they've deleted it in the meantime. But let's say we look at this building. Now, this is probably not the best example because there are some plants in here and this person probably was taking a very dodgy photo of one of these trees. But theoretically, let's just say you had this photo of just the building and there was literally no living organism in the photo. The way to basically remove it from the pool is to go to this data quality tab and downvote evidence of organism. Okay. So let's show that I'll downvote evidence of organism. You'll see that the observation now moves to casual. Okay, so, and keeping in mind, remember that I said observations will only appear by default that are needs ID. So this one will now be removed from me seeing it. And indeed, it will conveniently remove it from the pool for everyone for seeing it. So if you do see photos like this, I'm just going to untick that again, just in case they were focusing on the plants. If you do see ones like that, so 10 photos, all of the floor, the best thing to do is just go down there and downvote evidence of organism. In a similar vein, if someone has, so this is, I won't say common, but a instance that you will see occur is that when you get school kids that are being forced to use iNaturalist as part of some assignment, they'll often just take photos of their friends and upload them. All you have to do there is downvote organism as wild. Okay. The other main thing that we tend to do is that if you do see an observation where it's somehow related to people, so it's a photo of a chair or a lawnmower or a building, it is actually a good thing to add an ID of human. So don't just tick that no evidence of organism, but actually ID it as human as well. And if you ID it as human, you don't even have to actually downvote this evidence of organism. It will automatically make the observation casual. If you have a photo that is really, really blurry, so for example, a bird photo where it seems like it was a genuine attempt at an observation and they were actually trying to put up a legitimate photo, but it's just the organism was moving too fast or it was too dark or something like that. There are a few options. You can downvote evidence of organism, but I tend not to like to do that for those cases because a blur is nonetheless still evidence somewhat, even if it's not great evidence. What you could do potentially is tick this box where the question is asked based on the evidence, can the community taxon, so essentially the ID, can the ID still be confirmed or improved? So if it's just like this completely blurry photo and there's no way of telling what it is, you can tick that box no. And if the ID is at a level above, family or above, then it will be moved to casual, and again, it will disappear from all view. Whereas if the observation is currently sitting at an identification of subfamily or below, it will actually move it to research grade if there is more than one identification. So did that answer your question? There's basically, it's on a case-by-case basis, but you've got multiple options, which include ticking the reviewed box, which will only remove it for you individually, or downvoting one of these options in the data quality assessment, and possibly identifying as human if it's clearly a product of a human. And both of those things will remove it from view for everyone, not just you. So in terms of the other filters, there are nice ways of organizing things as well that are also present in the Explore tab. So the default tab is date added and descending. So what that means is going from left to right, you will see observations that have been uploaded most recently. So if I just refresh the page, this observation at the top left is the most currently uploaded observation on iNaturalist. Now, an important distinction there is it is not the most recently observed observation, it is the most recently uploaded observation. And you can immediately see that by the date this was observed. It was observed on May 1st. If you want to see them in order of observation, not necessarily when they were uploaded, all you have to do is sort by date observed. And you'll now see when it loads, the pictures will swap around a bit. So this observation is now the most recently observed one. And this one was observed 1 minute ago based on this different time zone to us. So you can also do things around the other way. So if I wanted to, so let's say I swap it back to date added. And as I said, and I'm just going to set New South Wales to be the place filter so we don't have to load every observation on iNaturalist every time. So as I said, so this one in the top left, this is the most recently uploaded observation for New South Wales. But let's say I wanted to see it in reverse order. I wanted to see all the old ones first. All I do is swap this descending to ascending. And I'm now looking at the oldest observation uploaded to iNaturalist for New South Wales. So you can see straight away, this one was uploaded 6.5 years ago in 2014. So really easy way to filter and mess around with things in terms of the order that they appear. Now, a really nice way of doing things as well, and now we're starting to get into the territory of filters that are not on the Explore tab. So these are more benefits of using the Identify tab. Let's say that you are really, really good at identifying caterpillars of butterflies, but you're rubbish at identifying the actual butterflies themselves. Well, what you can do is go search for butterflies in New South Wales. And you can actually, and untick that unknown box, you can actually add a filter, go ascending. Interesting. So that actually answers my question from before. So if you are using these filters here, you do have to actually use the update search button in some cases. I'm not sure. I'm just going to refresh the page. I'm not sure why that keeps defaulting to descending. Must have been stuck on that filter. Interesting. That seems to be a bit of a glitch there. It got stuck on that filter. All right, you just have to search again. Okay, so as I said, you've searched up butterflies, but you're absolutely rubbish at identifying the adults, and you only want to ID the caterpillars with which you have a lot of experience. All you have to do is go to filters, You go more filters down here with annotation, and you can actually search for life stage equals larva. And now I'm only looking at observations of butterflies that have been marked as being caterpillars. So is that fairly straightforward to everyone? And again, keeping in mind that the default needs ID. So if you wanted to look at caterpillars that have already been identified to species and confirmed, then all I have to do is tick this research grade box, and now you'll see there are a lot more pages. The really, really important thing, however, is that they will only show up here if those observations have been marked as caterpillars. So you can see if I go to this one, for example, and I click on the annotations tab, you'll see someone has marked it as a larva. This does not happen automatically. So there are actually many, many observations of butterfly caterpillars that will not appear on this screen for you because they have not been annotated as such. So one way that you can contribute to iNaturalist is by adding observations. So for example, if I was just to quickly go to my observations, and let's say someone wanted to identify flowering plants. If they searched for plants using the annotation flowering, they would not see this observation appear for them, because you can see I have not added an annotation. But if I go to plant phenology and click flowering, now anyone who is searching for plants using this identify and specifically using with annotation plant phenology flowering, they will see my observation turn up for them. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind, that if you are looking for all observations of caterpillars, or all observations of butterfly eggs, or all observations of butterfly chrysalises, they will only appear for you if they have been annotated already. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you are uploading observations yourself. If there is a clear annotation that can be added, go for it. It really helps the data filtering. So whenever I upload photos of caterpillars, I'll annotate them as larvae. If I upload photos of plants that are fruiting, I'll annotate them as fruiting, and so on and so forth. And so it generally, it may not be of any help to yourself personally in the future, but it certainly helps other people that may be specifically searching for observations with those annotations. Now we'll just remove that. Now a really cool thing you can do as well is you can actually look, you can specifically only search for observations that have been uploaded by new users. And you can also do the opposite and look for old users in inverted commas. So currently the default is set to any, but if I click in the past week, I am now looking at observations that only looking at observations that have been uploaded by iNaturalist users whose accounts are 1 week old or younger. So there's a couple of reasons people will use this search filter. One is that statistically, new users are much more likely to upload things that are unknown and accidentally leave out identifications than other users. So straight away on this screen, you can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 out of 30 observations that have no ID attached to them at all. Whereas if I got rid of that and I go any, and we just wait for that to load, you'll see that number goes down to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So immediately it goes down. But another way to do is that, and one thing I personally do, is I always like to welcome new users to iNaturalist. So whenever you join a new platform like this, especially if you're not necessarily someone who's involved regularly in the sciences, it can be a little bit daunting. So whenever I encounter users that are brand new to the platform, I always like to leave a little welcome message and say, welcome to iNat. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. A good way, and really the only way to find those new accounts, unless you accidentally stumble over them, is to set this filter to in the past week. And what that means is you'll only be seeing users that have just joined iNaturalist. And so then that's a really easy way. So if I were to click on this person's username, I can see they just joined iNaturalist yesterday. So if I were to then add an ID to for them on this observation, I'd just type a little message and I'd go, welcome to iNat. You know, and it's a small gesture, but I find that generally it's something that people respond positively to. And I find that if people's very first experiences and encounters with other users on iNaturalist are a positive one like that, then they're much more likely to stick around and continue using the platform, which is always a good thing. So I'll just remove that filter. The other thing that you can do, you didn't get a welcome. I apologize profusely. I try to welcome as many new users as I can, but Australian user growth has accelerated so much in the past few years, which is an excellent thing, but it inevitably means people slip between the cracks that I miss out on welcoming. So I'll use this opportunity to say welcome to iNaturalist, a belated one. As you can do with the Explore tab as well, you can also, of course, add filters for users. And this is just, so that's, for example, a user that a lot of people will be familiar with, Rainer. I'm now only seeing observations by Rainer, okay? However, let's see what happens if I type in my own username. Now, this is interesting that these turn up. Very interesting indeed. So there must be something odd about these particular observations. This is something I'm going to have to investigate myself, but normally what you'll find is that if you type in your own username, there'll be no observations appear, because that's another one of these default settings for the Identify tab, is that your own observations do not appear, right? But oddly enough, so obviously, so this is something that's, you know, this is clearly not working properly, because I've got it set to needs ID at the moment, and I have thousands and thousands of needs ID observations, whereas there are only 4, 5, 6, 7, 14, 19 that appear here. So obviously it's somewhat working, but for some reason the system is treating these 19 observations as being out of the ordinary. But theoretically, this is just a small tip. If you wanted to identify your own observations, you normally can't do it through the Identify tab unless you fiddle around with a heap of different settings, because your own observations by default don't appear. Now you can, no worries, thanks for coming, Tanya. I appreciate you tuning in. If you have any questions in the future about the Identify tab or iNaturalist, make sure you flick me a message at any time. Juliet said, I think I'll be using iNat via this more often, as it has way more functionality I wasn't aware of. Excellent. That's exactly what I wanted people to get out of this. One or two other little things. I know I'm rapidly running out of time. One or two other things with this Identify tab. So we'll just go to New South Wales. So what you'll see straight away is that all the relevant information is here. So in order, what you're looking at is you're looking at the person's username, and you'll notice that if you click on that, it'll open a new tab for you and go to that person's profile. You'll see that it shows their number of observations, and if you click on that, it'll go to all the observations for that person. You'll see that it has the date observed and the time. It has the general location. It has the accuracy. It has the country, and then it has the ID. Two little handy things. If you click this view button, it will actually open the observation in a new tab in Explore mode. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you click follow, you can choose to follow either just that, you can choose to follow the user, in which case all of their observations will turn up on your dashboard. You can also click follow this observation. What this does is it will actually give you notifications when future IDs and comments get added to this observation. So in this case, I don't need to do that because I know what this is. But let's say that this was some really cool moth, really cool wasp that I had no idea what it was. So I couldn't really offer my own ID or input, but I was really interested in finding out in the future what it was if someone else made an ID. What I can do is click this follow button and then click this observation, and there'll be a follow option. And then what will happen is that anytime other people in the future add an ID or a comment, I will be automatically given a notification at the top here. So that's a really nice way of following an observation and getting updates on it and learning more without having had to comment or ID yourself previously. Now, finally, I'll give just two more options. Okay, so there's just two more. So as I said, running out of time. So there's just two more features, two very powerful features of the Identify tab that are really, really cool. So one of them is this. So what I mentioned before is that if I go to add an ID and I start typing, you'll notice that I don't get any of the computer vision options, right? So if I click in this tab, I don't get computer vision options. I have to actually type in an option for them to appear. So let me just do this one. What you can actually do instead is you can click this suggestions tab. And this suggestions tab basically takes the place of those computer vision options. But so what it's doing is it's comparing this photo and suggesting visually similar options. And it's often really correct. So you can see straight away that this one suggested the correct one. And you can actually clear it and you can say, set it to tribe, for example. And you can say, okay, these are visually similar options that it's presenting that have been seen in the same place. So that's the really important thing. You can set, so let's say I clear. Let's say I clear both of these options. Let that load. So keep in mind, it does take a little while to load when you clear all the filters. So we'll just keep the filters on for now because it wastes a bit too much time loading. But essentially what you can do is you can set certain place filters. So let's say New South Wales. And let's say we'll set it to Ichneumoniid wasps. And what it's doing is it's giving you options in New South Wales, but again, you'll notice always seen nearby. So if you look at the little maps on the right, it's all in the same location. And it's comparing similar species from this group that I've specified, Ichneumonidae, and it's giving you potential options. So this is a really cool compare feature. So let's say I go to one that hasn't been ID'd. So let's say I go to this one. And this one hasn't been ID'd to species yet. You can see in suggestions, it's suggesting similar options. And we look at the top option, and yep, this is the correct one. So we go select, and it will add it as an ID for me. So this is a really cool way if you're sifting through observations and you are trying to identify things, but you're not really sure about what they are. It's a really cool way of looking at options all in the one place without having to necessarily scroll through a lot of things. So let's just pick another example. Let's go to this cicada. We'll go to the suggestions tab. So it's now suggesting different ones that have been seen in the same area from that specified taxonomic group. So you can see it's got all these similar looking cicadas. And in this case, the correct one is razor grinder, right? And then I would just click select and it adds the ID. So that's the first powerful thing in the identify option. The last one is you'll notice there's this little black down arrow above an ID. So if I go to any observation, you'll notice it has a little black down arrow. Go back here, you notice the black down arrow. If I click on that black down arrow, there are a lot of options. So let's say I've identified this one and I say, okay, this is a greengrocer cicada. And I've identified it and I say, okay, I know this is a greengrocer. This is a species that I can identify really easily. Then I think, okay, while I'm at it, why don't I identify all the greengrocers that are on iNaturalist that haven't been ID'd yet? And now this is a little bit of a bad example because they're such an iconic species that they're all going to be ID'd pretty much. But if I were to click this down arrow, I can actually click identify observations of this taxon, and it will open a new tab in identify for me. And it will now show me all the greengrocers that haven't been identified. So you'll notice that a lot of them are sound observations. So for example, there's this one, which it's as good as can be. But basically it will take you to all the ones of the same taxon. So then I could just go through and go agree, 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 agree. Right? Similarly, what I can do is I can say, actually, there's this option. So let's say I click this down arrow and I say, okay, I've just seen that Julie has uploaded this photo of cicada. That's a pretty cool observation. I go through and I see, okay, she's got a few other interesting observations of cicadas and other bugs. I should be able to identify a lot of these, or even if you don't want to identify them, just I want to have a look at these observations. What you can do is you can click the black down arrow and you click identify observations by Julie Graham. And you now get taken to a new tab in the identify page that shows you all the observations only by Julie Graham. So just a really nice, easy way to quickly filter for things. I'll just wrap this up very quickly with two last little pieces of advice, two last little tips. The first is that when you're on the identify page, you can actually use keyboard shortcuts. And what I mean by that is, let's say if I open this up, if you click on this little keyboard symbol down here, you can see that there are a number of shortcuts that you can use to rapidly swap from one observation to the other and add identifications or add annotations. So as an example, let's say I wanted to look at everything in this top row. Normally I would have to do one of two things. I'd have to say I click on it, then I click off it, then I click on the next one, then I click off it, then I click on the next one. And again, this is very time consuming, very tedious. Another option is to click on the first one, and then I have to move my mouse, click on the arrow, then click on the arrow, click on the arrow. And that's a little bit faster, but still a bit time consuming. Instead, I can do something like this. Now you see I am rapidly swapping from one observation to the other without even using my mouse. So this is not only a cool way of doing things very quickly, but it's also a really nice way of navigating the Identify tab if you're using, say, a laptop and you don't have a mouse. You can actually use all these shortcuts to rapidly navigate between observations. So what I'm doing right now to navigate between observations is I'm using the arrow keys. So you can see here, previous observation is the left arrow, next observation is the right arrow. Other things you can do is if you agree with an observation, all you have to do is click the letter A on your keyboard. If it's a captive or cultivated observation, so it's a pot plant or a pet dog or something like that, for example, you just click the X and it marks it as captive, and then you can move to the next one. If you want to add a comment, you just click C on your keyboard and then start typing the comment, and then you can click enter. If you want to add an ID, so for example, I'm on here, let's say I want to add an ID, I just click I on my keyboard and immediately it brings it up. I wanted to do a comment, remember? So now I've got to click off, click C, and I can add a comment. So these are just these really handy shortcuts that allow you to rapidly navigate. So two benefits. One, rapidly navigate all the observations. Second benefit is if you don't have a mouse or if you're working on something like a tablet, then it's really, really handy. The final thing I'll mention is that, so for anyone who's been to my other iNaturalist presentations, something that I tend to always talk about is editing the URL. And normally I've done this in the context of the Explore tab, where if you go to the Explore page, and I wanted, the example I always use is, I want to look at observations of grasshoppers and frogs simultaneously. Normally, I wouldn't be able to do that because obviously those two groups are very different taxonomically. But if I edit the URL, I can actually do that both at the same time. So if I search for grasshoppers, let's say grasshoppers and birds, just because I know the number for birds off the top of my head. So at the moment, I'm viewing all grasshoppers, and we'll just set it to New South Wales so it doesn't take long to load. So let's say I wanted to look at grasshoppers and birds simultaneously. All I'd have to do is edit the URL. So what I do is type and with underscore taxon underscore ID equals 3, because 3 is the numerical code for birds on iNaturalist. I press enter. Whoops, I've done that the wrong way. Actually, sorry, I got to add taxon IDs, comma 3, that's it. So what I'm doing now is I'm looking at all observations of birds and grasshoppers. So you'll see that there are grasshoppers and birds on the screen. So just as you can edit the URL in 1001 different ways on the Explore tab, you can also do exactly the same thing on the Identify tab. So if I go to Identify, I'll set it to New South Wales. I'm going to set it to grasshoppers. So now I'm viewing all grasshoppers in New South Wales. Let's say that I also want to look at birds simultaneously. All I have to do is go to the URL. Now, if you want to look at more than one taxon at the same time, you'll notice that at the moment it says taxon ID. I have to change that to taxon IDs plural. So I just add an S, then I add a comma, then I add the number 3 because that's the numerical code for birds on iNaturalist. Press enter. I'm now looking at all grasshoppers and all birds for New South Wales simultaneously. So just the way to find the code. So every single taxonomic level on iNaturalist has a numerical code. All you have to do to find it is literally just search for that group. So if I search for grasshoppers, you'll go to a page and you'll see in the URL, it will have the number there. Simultaneously, all places on iNaturalist have a number. If I search for New South Wales, I go click on that. You can see that the place ID is 6825. So I think I'll pretty much wrap things up there just because we've gone a little bit over time and I know it's getting a bit late for people. So what I will do is just say, open up for any last questions that people have about using this Identify tab, or indeed really any aspect of iNaturalist. But mainly, are there any questions that people had about the Identify tab or anything that was unclear or you needed me to clarify? Thank you very much, Jane. Appreciate it. So yeah, so just while waiting for any questions to come in, if there are any, just to sum up the presentation, if you want to just view observations for pleasure and you want to scroll through photos and look at what people have observed, then using the Explore tab is perfectly fine. And indeed, I use the Explore tab very, very regularly every day to do exactly that. But if you explicitly want to identify observations, and particularly if you want to identify a lot of observations, right? If you're just identifying 1 or 2 observations here and there, then again, the Explore tab is still perfectly fine to use. But if you want to go through a lot of identifications, you want to identify 20 things, 30, 50, 100, then the Identify tab is hugely efficient and always, always worth your time using. It's just far more easy to use compared to the Explore tab. It's a lot faster to use. It has a lot more features, a lot more filters. So if you are interested in identifying observations, really in any capacity on iNaturalist, then the Identify tab is the way to go. It does take a little bit of getting used to it first, especially if you've used the Explore tab for a long time, which I assume a lot of you probably have. That was certainly the case for me. After using the Explore tab for the first year or so of using iNaturalist, someone recommended swapping over to Identify. I was a little bit hesitant at first because I had to change my workflow, but within very, very quickly, I realized that Identify was way more efficient, a way better use of my time, and it was just overall a far better tool to use on the platform. So it will take a little bit of getting used to, but it is certainly worth your while learning all the tips and tricks. And as I mentioned, if you go to the Explore tab and you click on filters, and you can see your filters. Why is it taking so long to load? You'll see that, of course, you've got quite an extensive set of filters here. But if you go to the Identify tab and you look at your filters, there are far more filters that you can use that do not exist on this tab. So certainly, if you're looking to condense all observations down to a particular subset, the Identify tab is the way to go.
Well, Thomas, it looks like you've been fairly thorough as always, and I think that everyone's very kind of you there, Michelle. I think saying that she's mentioned your recent article, which is really good. If everyone's not seen that, I'd recommend that you have a quick read. Yeah, thanks a lot, Thomas. I really appreciate you doing this for us, as I'm sure everyone does. And we'll try and set up a few more of these going forward over winter and into spring, probably by Thomas or myself, looking at different aspects leading up to our other event in spring, which is the Great Southern Bibelets. So I'm sure you'll have a look at those and join us. We'll probably do a bit more advertising around those as well.
Yep, and we've got questions about where this video will be.
Okay, we will probably put it on good work, Thomas, on one of our YouTube channels, probably the one associated with the City Nature Challenge, and we can also probably put it on our GSB YouTube channel, and we'll send out links to those of you who have joined in an email through Eventbrite, and we'll also put a link of it up on the Facebook pages that I manage, and I'm sure Thomas will do the same. So it'll be available, and I'll probably post that tomorrow or the next day for everyone. Because there's a lot of content there. I always learn something new, and Thomas showed me about 4 things there that I didn't know about. So yeah, I think that was really, really good, as always.
So I've just posted 2 links in the chat. So the first link is the actual journal article that I published, pretty much summarizing everything that's gone on with iNaturalist relating to Australia over the past 10 years. However, if that's a bit dense, because that is quite a long paper, a lot of stats and things like that, then the second link I posted is to a roughly 5-minute basic article that I wrote that pretty much summarized everything in the full paper. So you're more than welcome to read either of those, whichever one you're up to.
And also, I'll just quickly point out that the link that he's put in the second link with the little brief article is for our website, which we use to administer the Great Southern Bibelets, and we'll be doing sort of monthly newsletters about what we do and about nature in general. So if you want to subscribe to that and keep in contact with what we're doing, particularly with the Great Southern Bibelets and the City Nature Challenge next year, I'd probably subscribe to that. I'd recommend subscribing to our little newsletter that we're going to be putting out. Okay, if that's everything, I might wrap it up and let Thomas get on with his whatever you're doing. I suppose you're doing some identifying from the City Nature Challenge and doing all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Let everyone else get on. So thanks a lot, Thomas. I really appreciate it, and I'll just stop this now. Thanks.
No worries. Thanks, guys. And as always, if any of you ever have any questions or issues with iNaturalist, feel free to message me at any time on iNat, and hopefully I can help you out with whatever it is.
And for those of you who don't realise, it hasn't been said before, Thomas is the beachcomber. So yeah, just look up the beachcomber on iNaturalist, and I'll put that in the email that I send out as well. Okay.